Welcome to the Washington Monthly weekly politics podcast. Uh, I'm Matt Cooper, the executive editor digital at the Washington Monthly. I'm joined by our illustrious editor in chief, Paul Glastris, and politics editor Bill Scher. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good
Uh,
morning.
Good morning. Well, lot to cover. Let's start with the crazy redistricting scene in Texas. Um, since last day or so, Democratic lawmakers have fled Austin to avoid having a quorum so that Republicans can go ahead with their very unusual mid-decade redistricting, a response to President Trump insisting that they come up with more Republican seats. Democrats obviously oppose this somewhat radical move because redistricting is usually a once in a decade process right after the decennial census. But Republicans are trying to carve out more seats to prevent losing the House next year. Bill Scher, you wrote about this last week. Tell us your thoughts.
Well, there was an analysis done by the Texas Tribune. I think Washington Monthly alumni Gabby Birnbaum was on the byline for that piece. Uh, and they said, so they're trying to squeeze out 5 more Republican districts with the draw. Quote, 4 of the 5 districts that Republicans have drawn intending to flip would be majority Hispanic. Now, we know there's been a big rightward shift amongst Hispanics, Latinos in the 2024 election and really over the course of this Trump era. But when you're redistricting, typically you're not basing it on just the most recent election. You're not basing it on what swing voters did in recent elections. You're trying to move in your known hardcore partisans to ensure you get that flip. And we also know from the Texas Tribune, a different article, that a lot of Texas Republicans were getting pressured by Donald Trump to do this, and their response was, "I don't know, guy. This seems kind of dicey. We've already kind of pushed this map to the limit, and we could spread our voters out too thin and get caught, in a backlash in a bad year, which 2026 looks to be." But of course, they did anyway. And so we have other evidence in polling nationally that Hispanics are shifting back left. We have polling that in Texas, the Texas governor is underwater, which he hasn't been for about 3 years. I mean, this is all kind of expected. Again, you have pendulum swings, and Donald Trump is a very active president, to be charitable. That's the kind of situation that tends to cause
Right.
backlashes. Uh, and if you were a party with a long-term view, you'd say, you know what, you do a lot of things, you push the envelope. Having a bad midterm is kind of the price you pay, but we'll get over it. Uh,
Right. So you're saying they're taking all this risk, but even if they succeed in this mid-decade redistricting, it might not work because enough Hispanics might swing back to the Democratic column. They might not get these gains.
Exactly. And that's why you don't redistrict based on what swing voters might do or what they did recently. That's a much riskier redraw. You see
Right.
analyses in the press that uh, these districts are plus 10 Trump districts. Well, they were a year ago. It doesn't mean they
Right.
always will be. That's the
Right.
risk.
Circumstances change. There you got ICE roundups. Trump's had popularity problems generally. Paul, let me ask you, I'm putting you on the spot a little bit, but Texas, Democrats are trying to run out the clock because they're in a special session that they called because of the flooding on the Guadalupe River that caused so many tragic deaths earlier this summer. Democrats are hoping to run out the clock. The governor said he's going to try to replace them. I don't know what the laws are in Texas, if that's even feasible. The often impeached Attorney General Ken Paxton has vowed to try to arrest the Democrats, but his authority doesn't extend out of state. And the Democratic leader is in Chicago this morning holding a press conference. So, do you think, and I know I'm putting you on the spot here, but do you think the Democrats can prevail in stymieing this thing?
Well, this is not the first time the Democrats of Texas have gone out of state to deny the Republicans a quorum. It's worked before to delay votes. I'm not aware of any time that it's worked to stop them altogether, because eventually, you miss your spouse, right? You can't just live in a crappy hotel room in Cook County forever. So whether they can stop this vote, I have my doubts. But whether Greg Abbott and Ken Paxton can arrest these folks, I also have my doubts. I haven't read the statute that Greg Abbott claims gives him this power, but the New York Times has reported that it's probably a misreading of a bad opinion by Ken Paxton. So I don't. They've not been able to do that in the past either. I think that
Right.
the problem is, as Bill wisely pointed out in his story on Friday, and our colleague Gabby Birnbaum pointed out, that the Texas Republicans' hearts are not in this. They know that it might not work. They're doing it because they're bowing to Donald Trump, not because they're all fired up. I think, and so in addition to the walkout of the Democrats, you have 3 Democratic state governors saying if Texas redistricts to add Republicans, we're going to redistrict to take away Republicans. That's Illinois,
Right.
New York, and California. And, that is not easy in any of those states to do, but it is possible.
Right.
So there's a mutually assured destruction going on here. And
Right.
that's what I suspect might, in the end, kind of lead to a peace agreement.
Gotcha. Bill, let me ask you, because as Paul mentioned, these Democratic governors are saying, look, we may have to fight fire with fire. And over the weekend, Eric Holder, the former attorney general who has led a big campaign for more nonpartisan redistricting methods, said, well, go, normally that's what I favor, but this is an emergency. Um, do you think, and especially in California, where they've already gone to a commission system, do you think Democrats, assuming Texas goes ahead, they are going to be able to respond in kind?
I don't know if they'll be able to match Republicans one to one across the board because there's not as much opportunity. There's legal obstacles. Uh, and if I may sort of expound on the question, as you guys know, I'm a fairly bipartisan person. I've talked about bipartisanship in positive tones in the past. Uh, Not that bipartisanship is always awesome, but legislatively speaking, it's often necessary, and when you can do it, those policies tend to stick. Um, but I've never been a bipartisan when it comes to redistricting. I'm all for gerrymandering warfare. I think in the end of the day, it all ends up being a wash. They don't really hold the fort when the waves come. So it's not like you never can win an election ever again when someone tries to gerrymander. We've been doing this for literally centuries. So it doesn't bother me when everybody does it. It doesn't make sense to unilaterally disarm. So if Democrats try to fight fire with fire, and even if they can't get Republicans totally even Steven in this cycle, perhaps they can mitigate. But you're talking inches here. You're talking a handful of seats. And sometimes it comes down to that. So I understand
Right.
why you would go to the wall with it. But the average midterm, the president's party loses 25 seats, and Democrats only need 3 to take back the House. So, I mean, Democrats have to really blow it to not take back the House this time.
Right.
And I don't think the redistricting wars are going to be what saves Republicans.
Right.
So-
Paul,
so-
let me
Go ahead.
Sorry. I was just going to ask you, Paul, the 3 states you mentioned controlled by Democrats with majorities in the state house, and I think New York is majority in both houses. The governors there are in an interesting position. Gavin Newsom, widely considered to be considering a presidential bid. J.B. Pritzker seems very likely to make a presidential bid. Kathy Hochul facing a challenge in the primary next year from her lieutenant governor, Anthony Delgado, former congressman. So are these governors in a way kind of forced to have to really push this because they want to appeal to a Democratic primary electorate either next year or in 2028?
Yes, I think that's exactly what's happening. And as Bill said, that's how politics is supposed to work. Nothing is depressing Democratic enthusiasm, base voter enthusiasm more than the feeling that Democratic elected officials aren't fighting. Here's a chance for them to fight, and in a way that people can understand and that is righteous because it's tit for tat, right? Republicans started it,
Right.
fine. We're gonna. So that's exactly, I think, what's happening.
Gotcha. The bearded man in the blue polo shirt again. Wisdom.
Yes.
It's a requirement here at the Washington Monthly. I know what's going on with you, Scher.
I didn't get the
Well,
memo.
let's move on a little bit. Now we had this situation last week where there was a smattering of different economic news, but if you look closely, almost all of it was bad. We have an excellent piece in the Washington Monthly this morning by Robert Shapiro, who was the Undersecretary of Commerce in the Clinton administration, and explains why we had the disparity last week between a robust GDP number and very, very weak jobs reports and very, very weak jobs readjustments from earlier this year. In short, he explains it because of the way they do accounting on imports over at the Bureau of Economic Analysis, who are the people who do the GDP figure. But in response to these weak reports, Trump acted with great maturity and wisdom and fired the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, a part of the Labor Department, in a move that hasn't been done since the Hoover administration. Widely deplored by economists on both sides of the aisle for, breaking the thermometer because he didn't like the temperature. And people like Larry Summers, the former Treasury Secretary, pointed out on TV yesterday that, it would take a vast conspiracy to adjust these numbers. It's not like the BLS head just does it by themselves. You've got hundreds of people who work in different teams to come up with these figures. And it echoes what private forecasters are seeing anyway. So any fallout from this bill, you think, politically, or is it just, we're just coming to accept that this is Trump?
I mean, politically, I imagine this is too deep in the weeds for the average voter to pay attention to. What happens in the civil service and the statistics. That's not the kind of thing that really grabs you. I deeply worry about what it means economically if the entire business and financial community can't trust the numbers that the federal government puts out. How do we make any kind of planning and budgeting and investing decisions in that case? When I was a amateur blogger 20 years ago, I was writing on this subject, talking, because this is when the George W. Bush administration was doing some hinky stuff with the civil service, and I had dug into Heritage Foundation papers about how they wanted to transform the civil service and make it more partisan, and were dismissive of this idea of a apolitical civil service. And I literally wrote about how terrible it would be if you couldn't trust the statistics that the government puts out. And when I wrote at the time, this seems kind of crazy. I know it sounds kind of sensationalistic, But this is sort of
it's like firing your radiologist, right? Because he's he's not giving you a reading of your cancer that you like. It's crazy.
Right.
It's totally crazy, which is why I think, even pretty conservative Republicans didn't take that step before, because they would think 2-3 steps ahead. Donald Trump is not a think 2-3 steps ahead kind of guy. He does what he wants to do in the moment, and how this damages the credibility of the federal government or the Republican Party is just not a concern of his. But we are where we are. And I politically, probably low on the list of things that, lots of things dragging him down. This probably is not going to be a big one. But in terms of things that are going to make the economy even more unstable, which will have a political impact, this strikes me as pretty big.
Yeah. Paul, what's your take on this?
I agree with Bill. I don't think that the firing of the head of the BLS is a huge political deal. And oh, by the way, I don't think it's going to even have that much effect because, as Bill said, these numbers are put together by teams of civil servants. The head of BLS does not have the ability to change the numbers. And if that somebody new comes in and tries to do it, there's going to be hundreds of people blowing the whistle on it. So eventually over time, if we have a real authoritarian government, yes, but I'm not sure that's the big concern. The big concern is the economy, right? We have a much weaker economy than we thought on Thursday. Or let me put it a little differently. There was great scratching of heads by a lot of people. How the economy seemed to be doing so well, even though just a few months ago when Donald Trump announced these big tariffs, the whole global economy went into a tailspin. What we now know is the economy is not doing that well. It's actually losing steam. It's as Rob Shapiro says in today's piece in the Washington Monthly. Business investment, home investment, all kinds of economic activity is half what it was last year, half of what it has been on average since 1990. It looks, who knows what the future is, but by the basis of the numbers that we now have, both hiring and investment, it looks like we're headed toward either a period of stagflation or possible recession. And that's before the tariffs kick in. And, our friends over at The Atlantic had a piece last week on the subject of the firing of these BLS numbers, pointing out that, the same point that we could be headed toward a recession at about the same time Donald Trump is really majorly taking readjusting the whole of the global economy with tariffs. And one of the reasons he did it is because he thought, the last time I tried and the bond markets went crazy, everything stabilized. So I think he and his team have felt courageous because of a strong economy that they could take these aggressive actions. And that's why I think he was so upset last week when it was revealed that the economy is really weakening.
Right. I think that's absolutely right. And just to add, I should say that Rob Shapiro, his previous piece to the one that's up today in the Washington Monthly, noted how very difficult the circumstances are that are coming up if we go into a recession, because the tools that worked during the last catastrophes, the financial crisis and the pandemic, which was cutting interest rates and putting a lot of stimulus in the economy to get it out of its mess, are not going to be available this time. Rates are going to stay fairly high because of the deficits and other reasons. So it's
the fear of inflation, right?
They're not exactly.
The Fed has to balance out its statutory requirement to control inflation as well as unemployment. And
right.
And as you say, these ginormous deficits. We're now at 7% or more of GDP for the next, which is something like double or triple what they were just, a decade ago. Puts a real hampers the ability of the Fed to use its powers to reduce the economy.
Right, right. And Rob's point also is that even if the Fed were to cut rates, that it's the Fed only controls one interest rate. Rates
Right.
can rise even if the Fed cuts. His fear is that they'll continue to rise, making this deficit even worse because we're going to have to borrow at higher interest rates. You can see more reluctance of foreigners to finance our debt. So his prediction of a recession is followed by the idea that we're not going to have a relatively simple cure as we had in the past. Um, Anything further on this before we move on? That
Only that we are only 8 months into the Trump presidency. It's been 8 months of turmoil, but not major economic collapse. And we've had hints of government dysfunction, but not yet major government disasters. Over the next 14 months, some or all of that is likely to happen. And definitely it'll happen between now and 2028, in my opinion. And that's where we're going to see some potential for real major political change in this country.
right. Speaking of political change, let me turn to the situation in the Middle East and the fallout from the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. We're seeing a real collapse, according to the polls, in Democratic support for Israel generally, and on this Gaza mess in particular, with something like 7% of Democrats approving of Israeli policy in Gaza. This week, three prominent podcasters, the Pod Save America fellas, who are all Obama administration veterans, all said we've got to cut off aid to Israel. That this is they said their boss, who had signed a lot of aid to Israel and a memorandum of understanding that left about $3 billion a year going over to Israel, and of course helped build the Iron Dome that's done so much to defend Israel. These fellows want to end all aid to Israel. That would include defensive weapons like Iron Dome. On the Republican side, I don't know if she's a leading indicator or not, but the very outspoken Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene from Georgia, a fierce Trump voice, is saying that this is genocide. She's joining those, including some genocide scholars and some Israelis, in saying that this constitutes genocide. Many do not. But let me ask you about the domestic U.S. politics of this. Is this a real kind of permanent shift? Is it something that could evaporate if the situation in Gaza returns to something resembling normal? What do you think, Bill?
I mean, Israel for a very long time was a bipartisan cause, and this government, current Israeli government, is so far right and so militaristic that that's shattered. And I wouldn't necessarily call it permanent because the Israeli government can change. We hear that there is backlash to the Netanyahu government because they still won't prioritize getting back all the hostages, despite having achieved militarily everything they could possibly want to achieve or close to. Putting aside, obviously, the absolutely unconscionable human cost that's been involved. So I'm no expert on Israeli political dynamics. If the next election would actually bring in a more moderate government, but if that happened, perhaps support for Israel in America would fall less along party lines. Of course, as you know, but as you point out, there's a faction of Republicans who are isolationists, perhaps a bit anti-Semitic, that are not necessarily fans of what Netanyahu is doing either. So it definitely makes things very scrambled politically, uh, and I think most importantly, has set back any hope of having a two-state solution. Who knows how long? But that to me is where the North Star should still be. But it's very hard to see how you get from point A to point B when you have an Israeli government that has literally zero interest in it, and you also have
Right.
an Hamas leadership that has no interest in it.
Right. Paul, what's your sense?
Well, it's not just Democrats who are upset with the starvation in Gaza. It's Donald Trump. He just seems very, very rattled by this. And it's curious because, a few weeks ago, he was sitting down with Benjamin Netanyahu, as we discussed on this program, agreeing that with a policy of ethnically cleansing the Gazans. Well, dude, starving the Gazans is how you ethnically cleanse them. So, it's a very, very confused policy coming out of the White House. And I don't know how his sort of split screen views are being absorbed by the sort of heart of the party, the elected officials, the voters, and whether he's never been a big fan of Benjamin Netanyahu, as you know. And I don't think he ever wanted to bomb Iran and got boxed into it by Netanyahu. But so I really don't know where domestically this all goes. Certainly there's more support for Netanyahu and the current Israeli policy, among Republicans than Democrats. But things could change, as Bill said, in Israel very quickly too.
Right. I should note news over the weekend that all the former, except for a few, but pretty much all the living former heads of Mossad and Shin Bet, the Israeli intelligence services, wrote a letter to Netanyahu saying that this is a crazy policy, that he walked into Hamas's trap, essentially, that Hamas wanted a humanitarian crisis. They've never had any much regard for their own civilian population by putting, their tunnels and missiles under mosques and hospitals and schools, and that he had walked into this, and that this policy aimed at getting every last Hamas militant wiped out had created a diplomatic and military catastrophe for Israel. So there are a lot of pro-Israeli voices that are, very uncomfortable with where Netanyahu has led this. And of course, there is a belief in Israel that Netanyahu, who faces legal peril there, is very eager to stay in office to avoid that legal peril. I'm wondering, I think we need to go ahead and start our, any predictions of things you're watching this coming week, things you're keeping an eye on generally. Bill?
I always go back to things that are kind of in the weeds of Congress, but they finally went home. There were some, I think when we met last, I said, let's see if they stay open in August to go through the judicial nominations, and they didn't. The Democrats didn't play ball for the most part, and so they didn't. So the Senate went home, and the House went home early, so they wanted to deal with the Epstein stuff anymore. So I guess one thing to kind of keep an eye on over the month, because right now we actually have seen the Epstein stuff kind of ebb off of the front pages, because other things always crop up. There's always crazy stuff. But can Tom Massey and Ro Khanna in the House keep that drumbeat alive? So when they do come back in September, it is still top of mind in House members. They still can put House Republicans on the hot seat And so it doesn't totally go away and still makes things very difficult for any legislation to move forward in the House.
Right. Paul?
Well, with Congress adjourned and Donald Trump home alone, you got to figure, he's going to fill whatever vacuum is there. He fills all spaces anyway. And what he's been doing recently is picking more fights with more colleges. We're right in the middle of putting the finishing touches on our annual college guided rankings issue. So this is sort of top of mind for me. And it's pretty depressing to watch some of our most elite colleges trying to cut deals that they know or should know aren't going to hold with a guy who tears up the last deal and makes new demands anyway. So it's a pretty sad time to watch higher ed, but there are a few heroes out there. The president of Princeton being one of them, and some great colleges out there that are being hurt by the cuts in research funding, but every day are out there helping young people of modest means earn degrees. So I'll just be keeping an eye on what kind of mischief home alone Donald Trump will be doing.
Right. I should say before I offer my thoughts on what I'm keeping an eye on that you should follow the Washington Monthly's YouTube channel. We're also on Facebook. We're on Instagram. We're on X. We can be followed everywhere. Also, subscribe to the Washington Monthly. This takes money to run a magazine, and a subscription is greatly valued. And of course, hit the like button as often as possible. It really makes a difference. I'd say I'm going to keep an eye on this tariff fallout, because we're going to see what the reciprocal tariffs are from the other countries, that are getting pummeled. And there's a big story in the Times today about Malaysia, not a small country, that's really getting pounded. What are they going to do in response? I think there's going to be considerable fallout, and I think the economic fallout for American businesses is really, it just has created so much uncertainty. A friend of mine is on the board of a major company that moved a lot of business out of China in the first term, sensing that the tariffs were coming, whether the president was Republican or Democratic. Moved a lot to Vietnam, and of course Vietnam now in the midst of a big tariff threat, and also the carrot of Trump's wanting to build a multi-billion-dollar resort there, and is linking, tribute to him to our trade policy. I'm also going to follow this court case that's going to say that's being led by the former Solicitor General Neil Patel, that says Trump has overused his powers to do these unilateral tariffs. That they're supposed to be emergency powers. You can't declare an emergency every other day and then seize these powers. And if Congress is not going to fight to get that power back, then people are going to try to do it in the courts. And they seem to have gotten a pretty good reception, certainly in the international trade courts and such. But now we're going to see what happens in the American courts. So
a quiet August. I said it's a quiet August. We're not going to have much going on. So
yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, gentlemen, thank you. Appreciate it. We will see you next week. Quiet August or not, bring your blue polo shirt and your beard, and we'll see you next time.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.